The big news here, now this is big news that happened yesterday, and the reason that it's such big news is that this show, and this show alone, since 2018, has been saying that Australian taxpayers, your money was going to the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, the awkwardly named UNRWA. Now, UNRWA is responsible for the education of Palestinians in Gaza and elsewhere, and your money, this is the cover of The Spectator, back in 2018, when David Adler warned that Australian tax dollars were going to fund terrorism and the murder of Jews. Everyone told us, conspiracy theory, outrageous, how dare you suggest that? Yesterday, finally, Penny Wong, and I did have a go at her last week on the show about this very topic. Penny Wong has finally suspended your tax dollars, $6 million of your tax money going to UNRWA. The reason being because the world is now sitting up and paying attention to the fact that UNRWA is being accused of funding terrorism activities, the very same accusation we've been making repeatedly on this show for many, many years. Finally, some good news, Rita.
Finally, but let's not forget that in 2022, this Labor government doubled the funding for this group, despite the fact that there were very good reasons to have doubts about where that money was going, how it was being used, was it falling into the wrong hands. They doubled the money regardless of that. Now it's been suspended. A number of other countries, including the US, have also suspended funding because there's fairly good evidence of a lot of UNRWA staff talking and celebrating the October 7 atrocity, but there's now an investigation into a number of UNRWA staff participating in this massacre.
James.
Well, look, I mean, we know that they celebrated. Back in November, I reported on this at the Daily Telegraph that many people who are teachers, officials, doctors, nurses with UNRWA, they were all on their social media saying, oh, glorious day, how wonderful the rape and murder of all these Israeli civilians couldn't come soon enough. Thank Allah for that. But there's a broader point to this. And when I went to Penny Wong's office about that, and they said they seemed quite concerned. It did seem at the time like they knew that there was a problem here. But the bigger problem, this whole idea of the UN Refugee Works Agency, the whole point of that has created 3 or 4 generations of people who still consider themselves refugees. No other people who have been displaced by any conflict consider themselves refugees 3, 4 generations on. And this fiction is the thing that winds up getting in the way of any peace between Israel and the Palestinians. Because as soon as you tell the Palestinians you are perpetual victims and your children and your children and your children's children have a right to go back to wherever, you know, the family orange grove was, rather than everybody else, basically everybody in this country at some point in their history was kicked out, you know, of somewhere, and we don't all ask for a right of return. It is time to end this and end this whole fiction of the right of return. Well, just take,
for example, India, the partition, the division of India and Pakistan. We don't still have people desperately centuries later.
But they're refugee camps in areas controlled by the Palestinians. So we're not even talking about refugee camps as you would expect them to be. These are areas that the Palestinians have control over. So why are their own people refugees in their own areas?
And they're taking all the aid to buy Range Rovers and dig tunnels. It's ridiculous.
The whole thing is ridiculous. But like you said, it is tied. It's a political mechanism. It is the victimhood mechanism, and that's what is the currency they trade on. That's why they've got people marching in the streets of Melbourne and Sydney for them every weekend.
Well, let's talk about that because, absolutely. And let me just briefly reiterate the point. Why does the Australian government, the Labor government of Penny Wong and Anthony Albanese, why did they ignore the warnings coming from this show year in, year out? They just completely ignored it and were paying your money, your tax dollars, to UNRWA, money which we warned, which many people knew was going towards funding terrorism. Why did they ignore the voices from Australia and press on ahead? And
you know who else knew? The UN would have known, or should have known. It's either incompetence or something worse, because there were all sorts of evidence and accusations and credible allegations being made, and yet What has the UN done? I mean, this is bigger than just UNRWA. This is a UN problem.
Absolutely. But also, let's not forget that Penny Wong and Anthony Albanese, the number of things they have done since taking office will show, and this is yet proof of it again, that when it comes to the crunch, Labor will always be opposed to the interests of Jews. They will always put the interests of the Palestinians before the interests of Jews every single time. They will then deny it. They will then be caught out like they have been on this, and they will then suddenly panic. Rita?
And we should not forget that Labor is in an alliance with the Greens. There's no doubting it. They would never be elected without those Greens preferences. And we know where the Greens stand on Israel. We know where the Greens stand on all these issues. They are on the extremes, and Labor is in an alliance with them. It may not be an official alliance like the Liberal National Coalition, but it is a coalition nonetheless.
Well, yeah, all of that is absolutely correct. But the bigger issue, too, is to say, well, fine, it's one thing to say, you know, Labor will not take the side of the Jews in any of these sorts of disputes. That's fine. I mean, they used to. They used to once upon a time.
Hawke,
and there are still some members of the Labor caucus. There's still some members of the Labor caucus who are quite sensible on this still. But unfortunately, they're in the minority, because what's happened is that Labor, as you say, drawn to the left by the Greens, they have been infected with this sort of academic Marxism that equates Judaism and Israel with colonialism, with Western civilization, all of the things that they hate. Hamas is obviously, no matter what they do, is, you know, the oppressed, so they're the victims. So whatever they do, you know, they must have had a reason. They look at Hamas's crime and say, oh, well, if Hamas was so brutal and so terrible, they must have had a good reason. That's their logic for it. That's how twisted it is.
Oppressor-oppressive narrative.